I am Matt Brim. I'm the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, proudly hosted by the CUNY Graduate Center at 34th and 5th in Manhattan. Today, we are here to celebrate three of our fellowship winners, and we will get to that just in a second. But before we do, I want to say a few words about CLAGS, the organization. We are the first research center in the US dedicated to the study of LGBTQ people and ideas and histories that is university based. We have one mission, and that is to bring free, accessible LGBTQ studies to everybody. This year's programming arc at CLAGS offers, among many other wonderful events, two speaker series, and I just want to invite you to two upcoming events in those series. The first is a queer of color, trans of color conversation with Joseph Ponce, who teaches at Ohio State University, and he will be in conversation with one of the board chairs of CLAGS, James Harris, and we will put a registration link in the chat. That is the registration link to the Queer of Color, Trans of Color conversation on February 28th at 4 p.m. I also want to invite you to attend a second event coming up soon on March 6th. I'm going to put the registration link in the chat. On March 6th, we will feature our scholar in residence, Christina Chica. Christina is currently a graduate student at UCLA, and she will be presenting her work, Queer Metropolis, LGBTQ plus placemaking in Mexico City. And that event will be part of our Queer Class Relations series. We're very excited to hear from Christina, who has been our great scholar in residence this year. Again, that's March 6th from 4 to 5:30. Whereas the Queer of Color conversation was online only, we welcome you into the Graduate Center for the Queer Metropolis event on March 6th from 4 to 5:30, and it will also be online, and you can register at the second link in the chat. To fully support our mission of bringing free queer studies to everybody, because everybody deserves free queer studies, it's my privilege to ask for your help. As a research center at a public urban university that serves poor students and working class students, undocumented students, and many students of color, CLAGS is simply not given the kinds of institutional resources that we need. And so please know that when you contribute to CLAGS, you contribute to making a different legacy for LGBTQ studies. You can share CLAGS' commitment to this different legacy by going to our giving site, and that is at Network for Good. I'll put the link in the chat. Or you can always go to clags.org, which is our website, or email us if you'd like more information at info@clags.org. I thank you ahead of time for giving a little or giving a lot at our Network for Good giving site. It enables us to bring programming like today's event to you. And so let's get to today's main event. Each year, CLAGS offers a number of fellowships to scholars working in queer and transgender studies. And so today, we are here to celebrate three of CLAGS' recent fellowship winners. The Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies honors the memory of Sylvia Rivera, a transgender activist. And this award goes to the best book or article to appear in transgender studies in the past year. And so this is the winner of the 2022 Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies is Cheyenne Bhadra. Congratulations, Cheyenne, who is an assistant professor at the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. Our second recipient is the recipient of the Duberman-Zal Fellowship. And that fellowship is an endowed prize named for CLAGS founder and first executive director, Martin Duberman, and his partner, Eli Zal. And this fellowship is awarded to a graduate student, an independent scholar, or an adjunct from any country doing scholarly research in LGBTQ studies or queer experience. And the winner of the 2022 Duberman-Zal Fellowship is Noma Onwuegbuchi. Noma is a PhD student in the Department of African Cultural Studies with a minor in Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin. Congratulations, Noma. And finally, the Monette-Horwitz Dissertation Prize honors the memory of Monette, a poet and author, and his partner Horwitz, an attorney, and is given for the best dissertation in LGBTQ studies, broadly defined by a PhD candidate within the City University of New York system. And the winner of the 2023 Monette-Horwitz Dissertation Prize is Sarah Schwartz. Sarah is a writing instructor and literature instructor at Barnard College and at Queens College in CUNY. Sarah, congratulations to everybody. Congratulations. I'll be the one to clap for you, but everybody at home is as well. So how today will work is each of us, our honored guests, will take a few minutes to tell us about their projects and then answer a few questions with me, and then we'll have a group discussion toward the end of the hour. So Shayan is going to start us off. And again, Shayan is the recipient of the Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies. And their project is Inhabiting the State Subjunctively, Transgender Life-Making Alongside Death and a Pandemic. Shayan, welcome. Could you start us off by telling us a little bit about your project?
Thank you so much, Matt. It's such an honor to be in this particular space at CLAGS. It's been so many years just witnessing all the Kessler lectures and all the awardees presenting their research and the scholarship that CLAGS has been promoting over the years, the Rainbow Book Fair and so on and so forth. So it does sometimes feel surreal that I'm here presenting my work. Congratulations to Noma and Sarah as well. I'm excited to learn about your work. So in terms of the essay that got awarded, it draws from a couple of chapters from my ongoing manuscript. So the larger backdrop in which the work plays out, firstly, I'm an ethnographer of the everyday, and my work is with trans communities in India, particularly Koti communities. And the word Koti does not its translation is not exactly transgender. So Koti could mean those folks who are feminine, and so may or may not identify as trans, may or may not have gone through medical transition. And so that kind of a liminality, it's very important to mark that. But when it comes to questions of law, legal infrastructures, then transgender is the word that's used in all policy documents. So for instance, in India, we have Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. And so how the word transgender is now very much a part of state discourse. So now, so the larger backdrop in which my research operates is a seeming an apparent paradox. How does a totalitarian regime speak in the language of rights? In South Asia, in India, and in some other countries as well, there are totalitarian governments which have come through elections. So there is, on paper, there is electoral democracy, but the kind of ideologies that these governments practice, and in my case, I'm talking about India, the government at the center led by Narendra Modi, it is a right-wing government. But at the same time, how the government continuously uses particular identity terms to paint itself as liberal. So for instance, the fact that under a totalitarian government, there is a Trans Persons Protection Act, so which would seem like a paradox. And so it is within that kind of a situation that the fieldwork plays out. So what I'm trying to look at is that given the fact that there is widespread violence and where folks are minoritized based on their religious location, based on their gender identity, different abilities. But at the same time, the state is also able to use the language of rights through law to paint itself as liberal. So then what does the everyday look like for Koti communities, where on one hand, they are negotiating with the state to get sustenance in terms of access to jobs and education, while fully knowing that the negotiation ultimately might fail. And that is why I use the register of the subjunctive to mark the kind of negotiations that take place, where there is always a sort of uncertainty about the outcome. But at the same time, given the fact that one knows that failure is more often than not a given, so there is a lot of improvisation and innovation and creativity in staging those negotiations with the state. One very Puritan way of looking at this kind of negotiation would be complicity, but I would disagree with that kind of a critique, and would say that this is about there is a lot of resistance and resilience and creativity that one can find in everyday conversations, in the bureaucracy, in courts, in with government officials, that really need to be marked for the amazing strategies that communities deploy. So in this particular essay, I look at two specific events. One is the Transgender Day of Remembrance meetings, which have become really important across South Asia. I mean, it originated in the West, but how the and folks, a lot of trans scholars, including C. Riley Snorton, have written about how the TDR is a space of value extraction, where one's identity is reducible to death, and so folks can become interchangeable in terms of one person died or the other person died. The complexity of personhood is reduced to one's death, and how the media and how the state kind of extract value out of death. So that scholarship is there. And so I specifically look at a lot of TDR meetings to see how this kind of a meta framework also gets challenged. So for instance, in this essay, I talk about a non-funded collective collaborating with a funded collective, using the space of the TDR to mobilize support for itself so that it can again get resources to continue its everyday work. And so what was very interesting to see in a lot of these memorial meetings is that how when Kotis participate in these meetings, they might completely turn away from the visuals of the dead in the audiovisual projection that happens, or in the slogans and the banners which have photos of the dead on them. So they might completely disregard those photos and those presentations, but at the same time, they continue to attend those meetings. And so it is this space of negotiation where one is not refusing the fact that there is death, but how one inhabits that position of vulnerability, that becomes interesting. So the TDR in this particular case becomes a space where folks find community, folks find the resources to continue functioning, especially when the state has outsourced most of its welfare responsibilities to the nonprofit sectors. So that's complex space of negotiation becomes very important to mark. So what I'm saying is that my fieldwork shows that that violence gets woven into everyday lives, but even in this weaving of violence into the everyday, it is able to craft a social which sometimes generates imaginaries of an otherwise. But at all times, such a social is about the painstaking building of infrastructures that allow endurance and inhabitation of all the forces that threaten to annihilate trans life. So it is that space of negotiation with violence, with the state, and in that negotiation, sometimes how the imaginaries of an otherwise emerge. So how does a meeting of a funded collective raise slogans against fascism? Or how during the COVID, when the state paints Kotis as super spreaders of a virus, at the same time, it allows Kotis to take on the term super spreader, but also have access to vaccines, where given the fact that in the global south, unlike here, where folks often refuse to take vaccines, and in the global south, there is acute shortage of vaccines, right? So to not say no to power, but then how does one inhabit that power creatively is the work that I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Can I ask you a couple questions? And this is what, and it's really about the stakes of your project. And I think it's about you. I love the idea of finding kinds of critical compromises. And I don't know if that's the language you would use for what you're doing, but how have you found space in which to do that kind of work? How has queer and trans studies invited you in through models and just through mentors? And where have you had to create your own space within LGBT studies to sort of walk this line?
Thank you, Matt, for that very important and a very broad question. I've had, like in terms of mentorship, I have had amazing mentorship, not just within academia, but outside of academia as well, which is also equally important. So I have worked as a journalist, and before coming into academia, and I have been involved with Koti communities in Eastern India for a while now in multiple capacities, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes as someone who's writing grants. So I've kind of been witness to how these multiple negotiations have happened over time. And within academia, I see a lot of folks doing so for instance, at the University of Minnesota, uh, mentorship would also mean conversations with friends who are also in grad school or who are in other departments, some of whom are actually there today in the audience. And to see the fact, like what has been very interesting to think about, like how we inhabit the space of academia itself, knowing that the kind of violences that institutions, including academic institutions, are capable of perpetrating, right? Like what kind of bodies are welcome here and not. But at the same time, we also continue to inhabit these spaces and create our own spaces there, um, taking the resources from the university. Perhaps that could, like, the much used term could be the undercommons, but this is a little bit more quote unquote contaminated than that. Like it does not, there is no claim to purity here. And so when I look at a lot of minoritized faculty, femmes, women of color, queer and trans folks in the academia, and how they negotiate with the university in terms of mentoring strategies. And so when I see, for instance, my advisor, Jigna Desai, who has been doing that kind of work for a while now, or my friends here, like Emily and Colin, who are in the audience. So when I see this kind of the everyday nature of violence, but also how it also engenders a form of creativity. So across multiple scales, so be it in the space of the NGO or be it in the space of academia, and so that kind of becomes a lot of inspiration. Matt, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I have questions for both you and Noma about methods. And so I'm just going to put a pin in that so you can start thinking about it. And maybe I'll ask this question at the end, but about methods of researching the everyday. And so especially things like what kind of queer methods do you invent as you ask an IRB, as you write an IRB, right? And as you ask the Institutional Review Board to approve the research. And I think that's a question that arises in your work as well. I'm going to ask each of you the same question to end. Shayan, what text or resource do you want to mention from your research or from anywhere that you especially encourage scholars to look at?
Wow. Many texts and resources. I think Martin Manalanson's work has been really foundational in thinking about queer and feminist anthropology, particularly because I'm an ethnographer, and feminist ethnographer Kamla Vishweshwaran's work, fictions of ethnography, Shavana Shange's work, Black anthropology has been very important. And each of them are continuously, what is very interesting in all of these works is that they are grappling with the questions of power dynamics in the field. And that is a question that is very important to address. What does it mean for me with institutional resources to go into the community and try and write about that community, and how do we navigate the power dynamics? And the fact that this kind of work can always be situated, partial, and grounded, in the sense that the data that's being generated on the field is also a function of who I am as a person. So the folks who are talking to me are also responding based on how they read me. And that's why Kamla Vishweshwaran calls it fictions of feminist ethnography, or how Martin Manlanson talks about some of the interesting dynamics that he witnessed when some of his recent works around mess, for instance. So those are the kind of works that have been really very generative.
Thank you so much, Shayan, and congratulations on receiving the Sylvia of Rivera Transgender Studies Award. Congrats. It is CLAG's pleasure now to welcome Noma Onwuegbuchi, the recipient of the 2022 Duberman-Zal Award, and a PhD student in the Department of African Cultural Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Noma's project is titled Male Barbies, Trans Identity, Body Politics, and Social Media in Africa. Noma, welcome. Please tell us about your project.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that generous introduction. So I would like to share my screen so I could carry along using visual aids. Yeah, just give me a moment. Yeah. So I would like to begin my presentation today by saying thank you to the Center for LGBTQ Studies, CLAGS, for awarding me the Duberman-Zal Fellowship for my project on trans women influencers in West Africa. And Donna is not here, but I'm also grateful to her for her really warm, email correspondences. And I'm also grateful to Matt and Donna and other invisible actors for putting this event together. And thank you to Sarah and Shayan and to other wonderful members of the audience for being here. So as a way of introduction, my transnational project focuses on the experiences and representations of trans women in the West African media, such as in films, in novels, and in social media outlets. And one aspect of my project interrogates trans women influencers, including Bobrisky, Fola Francis, J Boogie in Nigeria, Ohe Martin in Ghana, Shakiro in Cameroon. And the significance of my research, I consider one of the significance of my research is to think beyond the medicalized imaginary of transgender realities in the global north. So my research kind of reconstructs, this idea that there's a global idea or there's a global experience of transgender realities. And usually in the global north, that kind of includes medicalization and access to hormone replacement therapy. But in most West African countries, gender affirming healthcare is not an option. So I'm asking a crucial question, which is how then do transgender realities exist outside this medicalized imaginary? So I aim through this project to reconstruct transness as perceived in the global north to include ways in which the term transgender shifts and has been given new socially constructed meanings through clothing, beauty practices, and bodily rituals. About methodology, I already incorporated it into the, so I'll just answer the question alongside. So my project engages an interdisciplinary, so I'm drawing from post-colonial literary criticism, I'm drawing from visual studies, I'm drawing from embodiment studies, I'm drawing from African queer studies, and I'm also using a participatory research framework. And by that, I mean that I am allowing my participants to lead the research process, right? So for instance, when I interview them, I don't go into the research field with laid out questions. I just go, tell me about yourself. And in that way, they kind of expose things to me. So that allows them to be community partners in knowledge production. So, but beyond oral interviews, beyond ethnography, I'm also melding oral interviews with cultural text. And I aim to do that to look at the way African and Black diasporic cultural texts are representing transgender realities, and also how these women themselves are representing those realities on social media and in offline spaces. So these are the pictures of some of my research participants. So this is Bobrisky in Nigeria, and this is Shakiro in Cameroon, and then this is Ohematin in Ghana. And my research straddles 3 locations: Ghana, Cameroon, and Nigeria. So Nigeria is somewhere in West Africa and bordered by Niger, Chad, and all that. It's a multilingual, multi-ethnic community, nation. And something that's very interesting is that I was able to use the Duberman-Zal funding to travel specifically to Nigeria, to major cities like Abuja, like Lagos, like Port Harcourt, like Calabar, to speak with my research participants. And during the interviews, they told me about what growing up was like, their childhood, how they've always been fascinated by the Euro-American Barbie, and how that image has helped them to, naturalize their transgender realities. And for me, one key question animates my project, and I'm interested in how the interventions of, these influencers, what do their interventions say about West African media as a tool of resistance and economic empowerment? But there's something I also liked listening to Shayan, where he talks about negotiation. And I think that's also very important when we think about, transgender realities and their agency. So apart from agency as resistance, which is what these women are doing with their embodied practices, they're also negotiating, they're also living with these constraints. So I really like Shayan's framing of, agency as negotiation, because sometimes these women, these people are not able to live outside the country. They're not able to flee the country for their safety. So how are they negotiating with constraints, and how are they also resisting? So that's how I like to frame what the interventions of trans women influencers are doing. So I just wanted to introduce you to give a face to the people I'm talking about, right? So I wanted to introduce you to Fola Francis. She's a fashion designer, she's a model, she's an entrepreneur. And I met with her in June 2023 when I traveled to Nigeria in Lagos. So she happens to be the first trans person to walk the runway. And this is actually a very big thing, right? Because in public spaces like this, trans women cannot, live, authentically. So she's also an influencer, and she has a gender neutral, company where she, sells and produces dresses for people, for LGBTQ persons who cannot afford to walk into a store and buy clothing that matches their gender identities. So this is another collaborator, another participant, Bobrisky, who happens to be the most followed, trans woman influencer in Nigeria. And she's also doing wonderful stuff with as a brand ambassador and as an online content producer. And then we also have J Boogie. She's also a fashion model for cosmetic products and clothing line. And something I found out when I went to Nigeria was that there happens to be like the Nigeria's mainstream audience has two major perceptions of trans reality. So for J Boogie, they call J Boogie the real trans, right? And then they call Bobrisky senior man. So that was something that I found, very interesting. And I also conducted an evaluative survey to ask people, what do you mean by senior man? And why do you compare J-Boogie as real trans to Bobrisky as senior man? So there are a lot of, despite the fact that these women are visible online and in offline spaces, Nigeria is a transphobic country, but that also happens to be an artifact of colonialism and Western imperialism. And some of the influencers I spoke with suffer different types of violences, ranging from cyberbullying to intrusive questions about their genitals to isolation at parties. So I remember speaking with J Boogie, and she said there was this party for influencers, and she had been invited. But when she stepped into the room, everybody just got up and left. And that was, very humiliating for her. And then she also told me about another trans woman in Rivers State, Nigeria, who was murdered in cold blood. So all of this draws attention to the fact that in the LGBTQ category, sometimes trans women, violence directed at trans women is overlooked, right? So, and Marcus Bay refers to that as the violent flattening of the acronymic specificity of LGBTQ. So one of the major arguments I'm making through this project is that influencers like Fola Francis, J Boogie, Ohe Martin in Ghana, Shakiro in Cameroon are using embodied practices. And by that, I mean clothing practices and beauty rituals, to consolidate their visibility, to affirm their gendered identities, to challenge hegemonic masculinities, and also to celebrate joy. So quickly, I just wanted to, do like a brief rundown of some of the events that I used the Duberman-Zal funding to attend in Nigeria. So one of those is the 14 years and a ball, which happened on, I think, June 30th, 2023. And I happened to attend that ball. And one of the things I tried to do is to observe how, trans women influencers use offline spaces to represent the LGBTQ community through fashion and to encourage trans and cis-square women to dress up and be the best versions of themselves. So this fashion ball was held in Lagos, and Fola Francis, one of my research participants, was a host. And after the ball, we had a quick chit chat, and she told me that this is something that is so dear to her heart. Using this offline space to allow people to allow LGBTQ persons to be like the best versions of themselves. And during this fashion ball, she was awarded, the mother of the year. And she also told me during a later interview that this award as the mother of the year inspired her to get an insibidi tattoo. So an insibidi tattoo is an ancient method of writing used in southeastern Nigeria by those from Akwa Ibom and those from Cross River, Calabar. So she was able to, provide this tattoo on her elbow that kind of reminds her of the work she's doing in providing joy for trans people who have been alienated by their families to celebrate their love for fashion. So I provided a screenshot of this invite from the ball organizers. So something that stands out is them requesting me to, they requested that nobody shares pictures and that we don't divulge the location of the venue. Yeah. So, and I found that very interesting because all of that alludes to, the climate in which these women live, which is one of the social puzzles that drew me to this project. I'm very interested in the fact that these women are able to live in Nigeria, compared to some other trans celebrities, like Miss Sahara, for instance, who had to flee the country for her own safety. So I'm asking questions like, what are the factors responsible for these women? What makes these women to be able to live brazenly, right, online and offline? So that's like a social puzzle that drew me to the project. So these are some of the some pictures that I was given permission to share. Fola Francis actually shared these on her page, on Instagram page, and we also took some pictures together. So all of this shows the ballroom culture, offline spaces, and how these women are using fashion to rewrite their histories in a country that has eclipsed them for so long. So some other events that I attended was the
Noah, maybe we'll let me jump in here
okay.
And just ask a question. Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm sensitive
Thank you.
about the time, but thank you for the work you put into this presentation and for sharing some of these images with us that we didn't have. Maybe I won't ask the question about what resource you want us to look at, but I do want you to say just a word about the politics and the gender politics of skin bleaching, which was a big part of the project, the proposal.
Oh yeah, so Bobrisky is one out of the many influencers who was a dark-skinned man and now became she bleached and she became a light-skinned woman. And in our analysis of or interrogations of skin bleaching, often look at it from a racial dimension. And people who bleach their skin or engage in skin lightening practices are said that, they often say that they want to become like white people. But like in my interviews with Bobrisky, she was able to divulge to me that, this is a way for me to naturalize my transgender status. I do not aspire to be white, but I aspire to become a woman. And skin lightening is an index through which I can, show the world that I have moved from point A to point B. Then that's what I aim to do. So using that as a framework, I am looking at skin bleaching not from a racial lens, but from a gendered lens, through which trans women influencers can promote their new selves online. And even more interesting was, I later wrote a paper for this, is the fact that Bobrisky is a Muslim, right? And she was able to talk about how skin bleaching also intersects with her Muslim identity, and how the sales of her skin lightening cream, Bob's whitening cream, how she's been able to use proceeds from that to, do Muslim activities like Saraka, right? So all of that is very interesting, looking at it from not just a gendered lens, but also from a religious lens.
Noma, thank you so much. And congratulations on being the winner of the Duberman-Zal Award. It looks like you put the fellowship money to very, very good use. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
And now Sarah Schwartz is the recipient of the 2023 Paul Monette and Roger Horwitz Dissertation Prize. Schwartz is an instructor of writing and literature at Barnard College and at Queens College at CUNY, and her project is titled Gaps of Speculation, Refusing Representation in Queer and Postcolonial Fiction. Sarah, congratulations. Tell us about your project, please.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I just want to say, Noma and Cheyenne, it's so great to hear about your projects. They all sound so exciting. And of course, thanks to CLAGS as a whole for having us and for recognizing our work. I'm going to try and be really quick about this. I am situated in a really different disciplinary space than the projects we've heard about today. I come out of more literary scholarship. But to that end, my project really arises out of a series of questions about form and about queerness. We might think about questions like, what might we gain by reading specific archives alongside and like novels? How do novels and fictions we create respond to and metabolize other technologies of storytelling and meaning making? And really, what might a narratological anti-representational and anti-respectability politics look like? And for me, one of the big motivating questions is really about how do we square that antisocial move, the kind of refusal, with the utopian making project, the sort of utopian gesture towards an otherwise, which we've also heard little specks of today as well. And so I really try and answer those questions in the project by looking, identifying and naming a strategy that I call nomimesis at this point, because I'm drawing on some theories of representation, mimetic representation. And I see this arising after the archive becomes available in the popular consciousness as an organized science. and as a sort of seat of authority, which I see happening really around the 20th century, and I'm happy to talk about why I do that, but it doesn't seem super important. So really the conversation is situated with that I'm having about these novels and the relevant archives is happening in a larger sort of 40-year-long conversation about archive, its disciplinary force, the archive as a disciplinary force, and also what actual specific archives are creating and crafting as narratives by who they're including and who they're excluding, or how they're representing certain bodies, who they're making objects of knowledge and how they are portraying them. And so that's really a project that ties together, I think, queer bodies, I'm just going to use that as like a blanket term, and colonized bodies, because a lot of these technologies that are entering bodies into the archive as criminal or others or objective knowledge really sort of solidify in projects of colonial governance, right? So the project related to sort of how literature responds to these ideas analyzes how novels from around the late 19th century through to the 21st refuse to mimetically reproduce just those kinds of bodies as objects of knowledge in ways that would be legible to the archive's records of them. So instead, they turn the sort of technologies of the archives, its organizing grammar, which is sort of a term Gikandi uses, back on the archive itself. And so through flipping certain archival techniques, there are different ones that I'm looking at, they manifest lacuna, like gaps in the narratives themselves that omit expected plot points or expected disclosures, but create space for an inchoate otherwise to emerge. So there's this double move that I'm trying to identify that both refuses that archival knowledge and makes a kind of utopian gesture. And that's what I'm calling this idea of null mimesis. So I think just to go one layer down on that, one way that I think this project is not just about queer bodies, but about queerness, is that these novels refuse representation, as I've been saying, and in refusing, they invest in a negativity. And by that, I mean, they're not offering a supplement to the archive or an alternative representation, right? There's simply a refusal that uses those logics of inclusion and exclusion foundational to this sort of object-making grammar of the archive. And of course, as a result, a gap appears in the text that makes space for something else to come into being. But it's really important that I emphasize where what I'm seeing and what interested me about this pattern that I identified is that the space that emerges isn't a space for entering a new positive representation. We're not sort of supplementing the project and being like, hey, we're here. But it's really a gap that something that can't yet be known comes into being, something that destabilizes the forms of the archive or the underpinning logics of the archive and the novel is getting opened up. So if we were to sort of give these texts voice in that space, it's something along the lines of, no, we don't need your representation, we don't need your knowledge of us, and we will not accede to your appropriate forms of subjecthood. And so just quickly methodologically, what I'm able to do this because I'm looking really carefully at specific archives alongside relevant novels. And really looking at what are the logics, the narratives that are being shaped in one story that are being refused in the other. So it's not simply an ideological critique, it's really a granular examination of form. And I don't want to run too long, but I'll just quickly give one example. I think about Christopher Isherwood, who we don't often think as, radical beyond his socialist politics, I think, but he's sort of writing in Berlin under the Weimar government. And for some time, the police in Berlin had enacted a policy of tolerance of the queer scene. I'm using queer as a blanket term there. And they amassed all of these records using these anthropometric forms, using fingerprinting, photographs, and creating these sort of long records in the police archives of queer folk or suspected queer folk or folk who were convicted of crimes adjacent to things that we would consider homosexuality. And therefore, they're entering these bodies into the record as criminal. At the same time, the police are literally surveilling the scene. They're bringing guests, they're bringing researchers to balls to watch these scenes of queerness. So there's toleration, but there's clearly a gaze being cast in one direction. And so I suggest that Isherwood, whose narrator is famously implicitly himself and queer, but also never really discloses any personal information, is sort of flipping that archival gaze onto the heterosexual criminality that he's observing in the Berlin novels. And at the same time, the sort of instability that his work creates around the truth effect of autobiography also calls into question larger truth effects of archive and record that I think are starting to sort of undo notions of liberal subjecthood. That's a very short version of that idea. But yeah, I know we're running late, so I'll stop there.
Sarah, thank you. I want to jump in and ask a question or two. And the first is, actually, the second question is going to, I think, open to a discussion amongst all of us. So let me just ask the question of, as you were doing your research, is there a text, even though we're in different disciplines, right? And even though people who are watching now and people who will watch in the future on YouTube, is there a text you want to point us to as that has been important to you, or a resource? Maybe it's not a text, something that you want to make sure you say before during your time here today.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a very obvious and boring answer for all of us, which is, I think, the work of Jose Munoz, who's just sort of ambiently around, I think, many of our projects, if we're thinking about that. But I guess as the literary scholar, I would say two maybe underread but great texts that I look at in the project are one called Looking for Livingston by Marlene Orbese Phillip, that's now out of print, but is great and mind-bending, and I teach it a lot. Or Confessions of the Fox by Jordi Rosenberg. Those are both great.
I'm glad you brought up Munoz, and now I just, if everybody can come back on, we can spotlight all of us. Sarah, congratulations. Noma, congratulations. Shayan, congratulations. I want us to do some work together now. And I think the work that we can do together, having heard everyone, is around the utility of the term utopia. And this is thinking about Munoz and his vast importance. But I wonder about what we do with that term now in 2024. Where is queer and trans studies? Where are these fields around the idea of utopia? Because I think we've heard some different answers that may want to, should we still use that term? What is the futural or the utopic gesture, or the terms of the horizon, the not here and now, the otherwise? Are those, in what ways are those useful in your work, and do you think more generally? And in what ways do you want to build on or refuse, rework the utopian gesture? So now you are guiding the field. Go.
Yeah, I'll try to speculate a bit. So I think the work, so to come to utopia before, like to think about hope, for instance, is very important, and it's a lot of labor to not lose sight of hope, because that's what engenders politics, be it the spectacular protest or the mundane, the ordinary. But hope is laborious and it takes a toll, and so in my work I try to. That's why Berland's work around the infrastructure becomes very important, to see like how logistics and infrastructures, everyday labors culminate in creating a crafting hope. And so then, to that question of utopia, I like reading Munoz, the Cruising Utopia, alongside Disidentification. And I think reading them together, I think, is very important for me, because often I think, and that is a bit of my critique as well, that often in reading, thinking about the horizon and the there and then, we often lose sight of the here and the now. And that is where the reading of disidentification really becomes important. And the kind of that negotiation with power, but that which is not simply complicity, but in that negotiation also a certain kind of critique emerges, the critique of the minoritized, which can ultimately lead towards the there and then. So for me then, utopia cannot operate without the disidentificatory gestures of the everyday. So that's how I think. So that's where the everyday becomes important for me. So to give an example, for instance, and this when I teach my trans studies class, and of course, one thing that I did not forgot to say at the beginning because it was so important and obvious, and sometimes we forget the most obvious, like Sylvia Rivera, the Sylvia Rivera. So I always begin my trans studies class with the Star Manifesto, and we listen to the y'all better quiet down speech, and the rage and the utopia in all of that. And then I also complement that with a later video by Sasha Wortzel, which is a video where Sylvia Rivera is looking at the Tenderloin, like at the meatpacking district, and saying that how so many folks have disappeared or due to gentrification. And so there's a lot of silence in that video. So then pedagogically for me, it is important to hold both the silence along with the rage together. Because if we only concentrate on the rage, that means we are also kind of fetishizing the resiliency and the resistance of the minoritized. And that is a lot of labor to bear. So it is also very important to hold on to the weight of that silence, because without both, then we cannot really imagine the utopia. So my approach to utopia is more around infrastructural thinking.
I just want to jump on that. I was quite taken, Cheyenne, when you were talking about your project, and I tried to catch a few key phrases, but there were a few. I think the idea of negotiation that you were talking about felt really important. And I guess what I'm thinking about and what you've just said and what you were saying about your project is that Munoz actually says, he quotes Bloch saying this, not himself, but he says that utopian imaginations are destined to fail, right? Something along those lines at some point. And so I think there is something that when you're talking about the labor of it, that is present in the work that I think often falls away when it's become just this, oh, it's about the horizon, it's about the here and now, that we've lost, I think, in the depth of the text. And so I think a lot of what you're saying about holding on to maybe more negative affects, or both the silence, the grief, rage, all of those present alongside that as part of the utopian as well, that failure is part of that the work through it, the labor of overcoming those is part of the utopian work, rather than just it being about, oh, we're reaching out to this thing that is inevitably coming in some way, right? I think that that's really important.
Yeah, I'll just jump in right after Shayan and Sarah to talk about queer utopia, queer futurities. So in my own project, although I invest immensely in sharing narratives of queer and trans people suffering violence and anguish in West Africa, I also mentioned the joys, the delights, the experience, despite limitations posed by post-colonial state actors. And I like to believe that the stories of my research participants are filled with resilience and resistance against gender and sexual discrimination. And this background for me continues to structure my insistence on nuanced perspectives in scholarship as regards queer utopia and queer futurities. But something that I found out during my research in Nigeria is that there is a paradox of the visibility of my research participants, and I kind of framed that as visibility traps to kind of show that the enhanced visibility of West African transgender influencers is yet to translate to freedom, for themselves and everyday trans women. So I didn't just only speak to or with trans women influencers. I also spoke to everyday trans women to kind of gauge if they feel that what people like Fola Francis, J Boogie, Bobrisky are doing online and offline spaces is actually, translating to real changes for them. So I spoke with a bisexual woman, and she said yes, what Fola Francis is doing is actually good, but she had this particular, she was very reticent about what Bobrisky is doing or online. So for her, she felt like, Bobrisky is a privileged, or some of these influencers are privileged people, and some of them put up, social media posts that actually make it harder for everyday trans people to live. And that kind of, makes me think of what Fiskamaya talks about, trans-normative individuals, people who can afford, privileged people who can afford to interact with the state, although they're also excluded by the state. So concerning queer utopia, I would say that people like Fola Francis, J Boogie, and my research participants are actually doing a wonderful work. But on the ground level, there is that reticence, there is that what's the word? Everyday trans people, everyday queer people are still very skeptical of, what this actually does for the LGBTQ community. But I would also still like to say, that despite that skepticism, that I believe strongly that single-handedly, the transgender women of focus, the trans women influencers I'm speaking with still inspire everyday trans women to become more brazen online. And through digital ethnography, I've been able to assess and analyze that. So on their social media pages, you would see, other trans girls who are not influencers say things like, "Oh, J Boogie, you rock." They believe us now. So that says something to me about, the future of queerness in Nigeria, and it shows how these women are using their embodied practices, their beauty rituals to increase transgender awareness in Nigeria, a country that is not trans friendly. So there's a paradox to queer utopia in my project. Yeah.
I want to do a couple of things here at the end. I want to thank Noma and Cheyenne and Sarah once again and congratulate you. Thank you for sharing your ideas. I wanted to talk a little bit about capitalism and the and the problems capitalism caused, but the interesting ways everybody here saw capitalism as sort of being reworked and not as almost the neoliberal transcendent everything it is made to be, but rather working within and against and alongside, but also underneath and around capitalism that you showed in your projects. We don't have time to do that, but it is but you evoke this, and so I wanted to name it. I want to thank Carls and Andrea, our ASL interpreters, for their labor today. It is our duty to make everything we do as accessible as possible, and you, because you're culturally competent, help us do that. So we appreciate your learning and your experience and your work today. Thank you very much. Also, Rod Hurley is the CLAGS Event Tech Fellow at CLAGS, and he has been working behind the scenes to put our faces and voices in front of the audience. On behalf of CLAGS, I want to congratulate our fellowship winners. I want to thank you for your time today. And I want to say, please stay in touch with CLAGS. And to the participants, or to the participants today, the attendees, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you. We saw you. And to all of our future YouTube attendees, please be in touch with CLAGS. Again, you can probably get in touch with Sarah and Cheyenne and Noma if you need to. And if we can help you do that, contact us at info@clags.org. Everybody, thanks for a great event today. Congratulations, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.